Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chris Taylor, and I am the advocate of the devil. Seeing Tom Holland play Peter Parker in Captain America Civil War was truly a sight to behold. A kid who looks like a kid playing a high school kid with all the twirls, web slinging, and quips that we expect from the webhead. It made me want to go back and rewatch what's already come out. And boy did Sam Raimi's trilogy deliver, able to translate the comic book exploits to the big screen. Acrobatic combat, some of the more iconic villains from Spidey's Rogue Gallery, and Uncle Ben that truly gave Pete his heart and soul. The music fit, the stories were good, at least for its time, and the love interests existed. Fans all around the world went out in droves to see each installment, but alas, something went horribly wrong. Filled to the brim with not one, not two, but 3 villains, Spider-Man 3 is widely regarded as the weak link in the original movies. There was too much going on, and while 2 out of 3 isn't that bad, and actually seems to be about the norm for these types of flicks, it was obvious to many that the grand finale fell quite a bit short from its predecessors, and I would be inclined to agree, but here's the thing. In my humble opinion, Spider-Man 3 is in fact not the failure that many would like to believe it was, and today I'm gonna tell you all why. Alright, before you guys start throwing stones at me, screaming,
Filth and lies!
Let me elaborate on the pink elephant in the film. Emo Spider-Man. Once Mr. Parker gets gripped by the symbiote costume, he goes from being a somewhat charming, most definitely dorky kid to being a garish, pompous, pelvic-thrusting douche nozzle. Most people see this as being a departure, not just of the character, but specifically how this particular story played out in the comics. I must stress most, as, well, I didn't see things that way. Thanks to the many different retcons, story arcs, and multiple universes within comic book fandom, I've learnt to view each medium as its own separate universe. For example, the Amazing Spider-Man comics are a separate universe from the Ultimate line, which is separate from the 90s cartoon that I grew up with and where I discovered Spidey in the first place. And yes, despite the films taking plenty of elements from the comics, the movies are a separate universe as well. It's one of the reasons why when Tobey Maguire's portrayal of the wall crawler didn't include making his own web shooters, and instead had the webbing come out of his wrists directly after getting bit by the radioactive spider, I was okay with it.
Go web! Fly!
Now what does that have to do with the third film? Well, if we take into account that this is in fact a separate universe, then it can be safe to assume that the suit would affect him in a different way. In the comics, it turned him into a sort of dark side version of himself. He was angrier, more brutal, the suit fed off his adrenaline, and it eventually got to be too much for Peter, and he had to get rid of it. In the movies, the costume would take what was already there and dial the volume up all the way. From the very beginning, Peter is shown to be a dork from top to bottom. Of all the people in the known multiverse who would know anything about anything cool, Peter is at the rock bottom of that list. So to me, it makes sense that this would be exactly what he thinks is cool. Nerd! Yeah, it's awkward as all hell, but it was meant to be. Secondly, this movie gave us something that the other two didn't. A different storyline. Think about it. In the first one, Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, meets Peter during a class trip since he's friends with his son Harry. Peter essentially looks up to Norman as a scientific genius of sorts, and as an aspiring professional nerd, even wrote a paper on one of his theories.
I read all your research on nanotechnology, really brilliant.
And you understood it?
Yes, I wrote a paper on it.
As the movie continues, he eventually has to fight and kill a mentor, a man that he looked up to. A typical story archetype. The student defeats the master. Spider-Man 2's villain is Dr. Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus. Another scientist type that Peter looked up to, and even works alongside, if only briefly. Peter is writing a paper about him. By the end of the movie, Doc Ock turns bad and is defeated by Spidey. Again, the student defeats the master.
Oh, déjà vu.
By the time Spider-Man 3 rolls around, Pete's got the girl, has the almost universal praise of the city. It seems he's finally found some semblance of balance in his life, which gives him confidence. Something for the black suit to eventually feed on and exaggerate. The villain this time, at least at the beginning, is the man who killed Uncle Ben, his father figure. No longer is the student defeating a master. At this point, it could be argued that he is the master.
So you're still master of your domain?
Yes, I am. Master of my domain.
Instead, Black Suit Spidey hunts down the man who essentially caused him to become a superhero in the first place. It's not old versus new, it's revenge. Ladies and gentlemen of the internet court, if you look inside yourself, honestly, and someone had killed a member of your family, would you not do the same? Would you not want the man who destroyed your family to die? But alas, it is a red herring, as by the end of the flick, Pete has shaken off the symbiote costume and his need for vengeance, as the Sandman is allowed to become dust in the wind.
Dust. Wind.
Dude.
And considering Eddie Brock in this movie is just a dark side version of what Pete's character was, you could say that the real enemy is the one that was inside himself. He wins by overcoming his own weaknesses and a mirror version of those weaknesses in Brock. And finally, there's this scene.
I'm thinking humiliation. Kind of like how you humiliated me.
On the surface, it's pretty standard petty jealousy that's morphed into full-on hatred. But take a closer look at how the tendrils of the symbiote are slithering on Topher's face. Think about what the symbiote does. Yes, it would be hard to deny that on the surface, that's all that's going on. But dig just a little bit deeper. The symbiote is its own thinking, feeling being. If it had stayed on Peter, it would have taken over completely. But it didn't. Instead, it was rejected, humiliated, cast aside, left behind, falling on Eddie Brock in the church was a stroke of luck, and in my mind, the way I see it, that isn't Eddie Brock talking to Peter Parker. That's the symbiote, hurt and angry at Peter for getting rid of it and using Eddie to exact his revenge. The fact that they both want the same thing is more of an afterthought.
You're kidding. What a crazy random happenstance. Here.
And in my opinion, it adds another layer to the conflict at this movie's climax. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, I do hope I managed to shed some light into why Spider-Man 3 doesn't suck. Whether it be in the purposeful groan-worthiness of pelvic thrusting Peter, or at least in Sam Raimi's efforts into bringing about a somewhat different story than the last two movies. The third movie in the Sam Raimi trilogy, in my opinion, is one hell of a closing point to a trilogy of amazing superhero stories. And while the currently only film version of Venom may not have been what the vast majority have wanted, I hope I managed to show you wonderful viewers that it may in fact have been just a little bit deeper than what you may have initially seen. As always, feel free to let me know in the comments below what you think. Which of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy movies did you enjoy the most? Do you think I'm full of my own web? By all means, bring up all of your points against my own, so that I may proceed to prove you wrong.
Kaboom! You've been lawyered.
But for now, in the case of Spider-Man 3, the defense rests.
A Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size.
Okay, the dancing may have been wretched, but that voice? No matter what you guys say, that is just the worst.